The president called it the worst environmental disaster America has ever faced.
And we're waging this battle every minute of every day.
Over the next 100 days, one man became the focus of a nation's anger. Tonight, Tony Hayward speaks out for the first time since resigning.
Of course, I regret some of the remarks that I made. I could have done much better. If I had the chance to do it again, I'd do it differently.
He wouldn't be working for me after any of those statements.
You go from being a big shot to having congressmen sit there and clobber you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You just sit there and take it.
The Deepwater Horizon explosion left 11 men dead and was a catastrophe for one of Britain's biggest businesses.
These were frightening days for those of us working with BP. Could it survive this accident?
But should BP's own past have served as a warning?
Without question, BP's safety record in North America is viewed as at the bottom. It's an embarrassment to the industry.
The public was angry. The American public had no reason to believe BP. BP, after all, is in the business to make money, not to satisfy public concerns.
This is how oil, profit and politics combined in a $30 billion blowout that came close to ending BP's extraordinary 100-year story.
We will make BP pay for the damage their company has caused.
Oil. We can't live with it or without it.
Oil is the awful lifeblood of modern society. We must have it. We don't want to see it, touch it, taste it, or smell it, but we must have it.
And this summer, the cost of our addiction was plain to see. On a humid Monday night in June, the chief executive of BP arrived in Washington for the most important meeting of his career.
I was on the phone on the way in from the airport with the legal team who'd been in the sort of day-to-day contact with the White House legal team.
The Gulf oil spill had been dominating the news for 55 long days. And now Tony Hayward had been summoned by the president. It was never going to be an easy meeting.
This was almost, I suppose, the peak of the crisis. The well was still flowing. It wasn't clear when we were going to be able to stop it, and there was a great deal of emotion.
BP was on the ropes, but the president was also under attack, accused of being slow to respond to the crisis.
Are you angry at BP?
I am furious at this entire situation.
The emotion and anger and frustration was entirely understandable, actually. The US administration hadn't created this mess, we had.
Three factors had combined to place BP at the center of a perfect media storm. The environmental disaster, political uproar, and now a growing financial crisis. Traveling with Hayward was Bob Dudley, then head of BP's North American operations.
There were some extraordinary days during the month of June. Confidence in BP was dropping very rapidly. The share price was dropping rapidly.
BP shares plunged 11% in early London trading to their lowest level since US trading.
Just 2 months before, BP had been riding high. But since the Deepwater Horizon accident, its stock had fallen by 50%.
Still spewing, and BP stock priced about half of what it was before.
Throughout that Monday, BP was losing value at the rate of over £12 million a minute.
How much trouble is this company in?
Word was beginning to circulate externally about the potential going under of BP. Could it survive this accident?
I could feel what BP was feeling and what the industry was worried about, because you don't know where the bottom is, and you don't know what the knock-on implications are.
BP found itself in arguably a unique situation that no one was expecting. BP prior to this was a company you generally didn't have to worry about. But all of a sudden, BP's long-term viability was called into question, and the normal rules fell apart.
The following evening, Barack Obama underlined the gravity of the crisis by addressing the nation for the first time from the Oval Office. He was ratcheting up the pressure on the company before the next day's showdown.
We will make BP pay for the damage their company has caused.
The public was angry. The trust that is implicit between a major oil company drilling off the coast of the United States and the citizens of the United States was breached. The United States government needed to be in charge.
I was surprised initially at what Obama was saying and the criticism levied out to BP. But on reflection I said, well, Obama had his own agenda. And I think it just brought home again this point that oil is not just about oil, it's about politics.
It was all so different just 10 weeks before. Then, it was the best of times. The oil industry was in favor, even with the White House.
So today we're announcing the expansion of offshore oil and gas exploration.
President Obama had approved more drilling around America's coastline, and he sounded like safety was no longer a worry.
It turns out, by the way, that oil rigs today generally don't cause spills. They are technologically very advanced. Even during Katrina, the spills didn't come from the oil rigs. They came from the refineries on shore.
Beneath the deep waters in the Gulf of Mexico lie great riches. But this is the extreme frontier of oil and gas exploration. BP was the biggest operator here. Their geologists and engineers were working at the very limits. The company had 650 leases, more than any of its competitors, and produced over 400,000 barrels of oil every day. In the last 6 years, it had invested $45 billion in America, much of it developing these fields, with exotic names like Thunder Horse, Atlantis, and Mad Dog. But the investment was worth it. When BP discovered the massive Tiber field, its shares jumped by over 4% in a single day, an extraordinary amount for a company that big.
It takes a lot, I think, to move the dial for a company the size of BP. Investors very much saw this as the beginning of a new dawn for the company in the Gulf of Mexico and also a new era of growth for the UK company. Tony Hayward's strategy was seen to be paying off, so absolutely it was seen as a company that was looking for growth and was finding it.
BP's success in the Gulf bolstered its reputation as a pioneer and pushed its value to nearly £100 billion.
I think BP's been a company that's been characterised by a pioneering spirit. It's always sought to operate on the frontiers of the energy industry, and it has had that for 100 years.
And the story of BP's century is in many ways the story of our century, the age of oil. Persia, 1908. BP started life as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, bankrolled by an English entrepreneur, William Knox Darcy, who had a hunch that oil was the next big thing. But it was a struggling venture, until a far-sighted politician saw the potential of this new fuel from the Middle East.
Without Churchill, there probably wouldn't be a BP, to be honest. He was First Lord of the Admiralty, which means he was the minister responsible for the Navy in the pre-World War I years, sort of 1910, 1914-ish kind of period. And he wanted to switch the Navy from burning coal to oil because oil was more efficient. Churchill argued for this in Parliament, put in £2 million and acquired a majority shareholding in BP. So BP became a majority state-owned oil company.
All went very well for the city branch of the Foreign Office, as it was often called, until the early 1950s, when a wave of nationalism spread through the Middle East. Persia, by now renamed Iran, kicked out the British Oil Company.
Forced to abandon what we had created in the wilderness, is it too much to hope that we shall see once more the tankers of Britain at Abadan?
The message was clear. Oil and politics were an incendiary mix. The boardroom at the global headquarters of BP in St James's, London. In April this year, as they prepared for their annual general meeting, the directors believed their company was flourishing, and the chief executive was in a buoyant mood, deemed by the industry to be on the path to success.
We've emerged from 2009 in great shape,
and with renewed confidence and determination. Since the beginning of last year, we've outperformed all of our major competitors. I think earlier this year, the company was doing really well. There was a lot of momentum. We had a lot of exploration success. We'd open up new opportunities in Iraq, in Libya, in Oman, in Jordan, and operationally the company was running very well.
And as a result, they could thank the shareholders in time-honored fashion with a healthy dividend.
A dividend is when a company such as BP takes a certain proportion of its profits for that year and gives it back to people who have invested in the company. They do that for a variety of reasons, but ultimately it means that shareholders tend to keep their interests in companies such as BP.
As an investor, you invest in BP because you know that the company's been paying out a very big dividend. These big companies pay out billions and billions of pounds worth of dividends every quarter, and investors like that because they know what they're getting. BP was the biggest dividend payer last year in the FTSE 100.
It's no wonder they used to say there are three certainties in life: death, taxes, and BP dividends. The company's influence on the British economy has been immense. Last year, its dividend paid out over £6 billion. That's £1 in every 7 handed to investors in 2009. And the immediate future looked just as promising.
We can see the prize, and we believe we're well positioned to capture it.
But within less than a week, everything was to change. On Tuesday, April the 20th, BP was in the Gulf of Mexico drilling an exploratory well in the Macondo field, named after the cursed town in a Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel. The company had high hopes of making another extremely lucrative strike. But Deepwater Horizon, the drilling rig leased to BP by Transocean, was running behind schedule and over budget. That day, a team of BP and Transocean executives visited the Deepwater Horizon for what they called a management visibility tour. They were also celebrating 7 years with no accidents on the rig. While the executives were given a tour, the crew were becoming concerned about the readings from deep down the well. That evening, the fluctuations in pressure grew increasingly wild. Then just before 10 o'clock, the rig started to vibrate and a violent hissing surged up the pipe from 3.5 miles below. Three minutes later, the US Coast Guard received a mayday from the bridge and flashed this distress call.
The Deepwater Horizon on fire. With all persons off the vessel, the person in the water. All mariners request keep a sharp lookout, assist if possible.
I heard of the disaster, I can remember it's 7:24 in the morning, Wednesday the 21st. It was confusing because the picture was not clear. We knew we had a big incident on a rig. It wasn't clear at that time the scale of the incident, and shortly afterwards we had a meeting of the crisis response team in London.
Well, I think in a career there's always a few days that really stand out for you, just like it does in life. In life, everyone knows where they were on 9/11. If you're old enough, you remember when John Kennedy was shot, you know where you were and how it felt. And this was one of those events inside of BP for many, many people.
Among the crew was mud engineer Gordon Jones.
I came into work and my secretary said that there was a fire on a rig, and the chances that it would be Gordon's rig were so remote, especially because it was the Deepwater Horizon. It was a sophisticated, advanced, modern, well-designed rig.
We are actively continuing a search and rescue effort and holding out hope that we may find one of these 11 missing people.
Gas had surged up the pipe to the rig, where it ignited and caused a massive explosion, a blowout.
Gordon's body was cremated by the fire and washed into the ocean by the fireboats. And so I'll never have the least trace of my son to be able to say goodbye to.
36 hours after the explosion, the Deepwater Horizon slipped below the waves. And then the question started. Was there anything about BP's corporate culture that had played a part in this disaster?
Without question, BP's safety record in North America compared to its other large integrated competitors is viewed as at the bottom. It's an embarrassment to the industry. I'm sorry to say that, but it is an embarrassment to the industry that one of these well-named, well-branded companies has such a terrible track record.
The company has always had this strong ethos around safety. It's already also had a business model that drives for performance, and we've got to continue to find that right balance. And I think now we're going to put in place the checks and balances to be able to manage risk and safety yet again to another level in the company.
To understand the controversy over the company's safety record, one needs to know what happened after one of the most important events in BP's history. In 1987, the Conservative government sold off its last shares in the oil company, and it was reborn as a private enterprise. It was a middle-ranking two-pipeline company with its main reserves in the North Sea and Alaska. The outlook was bleak. The price of oil was falling, and BP was in danger of being swallowed up by one of its larger competitors. In order to prosper, it had only one option. It had to expand. And soon, it had the man to do that. A charismatic new leader with global ambitions. John Brown was a visionary and one of the most dynamic businessmen of his generation.
He was urgent about wanting to grow. He also had a very strong view that we were underperforming.
Brown's bold solution was to sign a deal with the American oil giant Amoco. It was a masterstroke. BP was now the largest producer of oil and gas in the United States.
The £69 billion deal is the biggest industrial merger in history.
Amoco offered some of the things that we wanted, which was a wider global reach, strength in America, and a skill base that we didn't have at the time.
Something extraordinary is coming to Amoco.
In the next 9 months, BP's share price rose by a third, giving the combined company even more muscle to grow bigger still.
BP's focus on a growing share price just keeps it competitive. It increases the size of the company, is more likely to fend off bid approaches from its competitors.
And the best part is, this is just the beginning.
But also it means that it's more able to make acquisitions itself of smaller companies. So really having a growing share price is key to the future of the company.
And BP used its new size to swallow up another old established American competitor, Arco.
Right Honourable Tony Blair and our Chief Executive, John Brown. Enjoy your trip. Many thanks. All the best to you.
John Brown was now feted by the media and statesmen as one of Britain's greatest business leaders. The Prime Minister was entranced by the man who had turned BP into one of the 3 top energy companies in the world.
I introduced John to Tony Blair. He had not actually met John, so I arranged for the meeting. Blair was fascinated by John, I think, and they had a very good relationship. They both understood that they were trying to bring about change, and they both were rather impatient, but it was an absolute meeting of minds. I think John took what I like to think of as somewhat a second division company and put it amongst the Premier League through a series of groundbreaking transactions, and it was a great time to be involved with BP.
Under Brown, the company gained a reputation for pulling off big financial deals, but it was also known for cutting costs.
After an integration or mergers like that, and particularly again during the $9 period of oil, there were lots of decisions made to have to slim the company down. And undoubtedly those are tough decisions, and sometimes you do lose capability. But I would not say there was a broad taking out of capability of the companies at that time.
But this cost-cutting was controversial. Some executives who have since left BP believe it may have had an impact on the safety culture of the company.
Keep in mind the combined enterprise happened because of the need to reduce costs, so it's not unthinkable that people lost their jobs. What I'm suggesting is that we probably lost too much industrial knowledge that allowed the combined enterprise to function safely in the future. And I think if you look at ExxonMobil, for example, two enterprises of equal scale, I don't think went through the trauma that BP, Amoco, and Arco went through, and I think their track record is somewhat different than BP's.
BP's new American empire stretched from coast to coast. Huge oil and gas fields, vast pipelines, and a massive network of installations. But integrating these assets was the challenge.
The mergers were never integrated as they should have been. And we could see it as competitors, that there was a lot of confusion in BP. There was a lot of wannabe activity inside BP. A lot of money thrown at problems, but a lot of money was taken out of some of the day-to-day operations at the same time. We could all see it.
I've heard those comments about the safety culture of BP and taking on too much risk. We're partners with some of the companies that have made those statements in various parts around the world. I don't think that is the case. I think our industry is taking on more and more risks now. The key for BP and all the companies in the industry, we've got to show they can manage that risk very, very carefully.
Among that patchwork of assets BP had acquired was an old oil refinery in Texas City. It was poorly maintained, and it was not well run.
A plant just blew up. Oh my God. I was sitting at a red light and it blew up and I felt it in my body and like
15 workers died and 180 were injured. BP was fined over $100 million, a record amount, after an official report exposed systemic safety problems at the plant.
They had other priorities. I mean, their priorities were to make these plants, I think, as profitable as they could, and they were, trying to squeeze every dollar they could out of the plant. They didn't expressly say cut back on safety, but I think when you start cutting back that significantly on the funding needed to maintain a plant, it inevitably has an impact on safety.
Just 4 months after the refinery explosion, Thunder Horse, the company's flagship rig, listed badly and nearly sank.
There was one valve that apparently was installed backwards, and because it was installed backwards, it allowed water to go one direction and not the other direction, and it prevented it from keeping the platform level. So something as small as a single valve, probably on the order of 8 or 10-inch valve, almost caused the disaster of the entire platform.
And there was more to come. On the unspoilt North Slope of Alaska, an embarrassing leak from a BP pipeline. John Brown's company was beginning to look accident-prone.
What I saw in BP as a competitor was a desire to please the investors rather than to take care of the many other stakeholders that need to be taken care of. That pipeline was old on the North Slope when BP took ownership. The Texas City refinery and other refineries were old. They need to be looked at in terms of reinvestment, not disinvestment. So I think they took the wrong tack, and they've paid an awful price for it.
But BP says it's too simplistic to link the company's previous accidents with this year's disaster.
People ask me if there's a common denominator between the accidents in North America. They're very, very different in nature. What we're going to do is just continue to double and triple our approach to managing risk in what is a risky business and risky industry going forward. There's no question about that.
However, when Lord Browne was replaced by his protege, Tony Hayward, the new chief executive promised to focus like a laser on safety.
I think when there's a change at the top, there's always an opportunity to step back and take stock. BP have been through an extraordinary period of consolidation, and we put together half a dozen companies with different cultures, different management systems, and there was no doubt there was a need to increase the focus and improve the performance in the matter of safe and reliable operations, and that became the overarching focus for my period at BP, really, to take this combination of many companies and turn it into a safe and reliable operating company, and that was the entire focus, and you know, it was beginning to bear significant results.
Coast has received a report of the Deepwater Horizon on fire.
And then came the blowout in April. With its controversial safety record, BP was on the defensive from day one. But in the immediate aftermath, there looked to be some hope that an environmental disaster may have been averted.
At this time, there is no crude emanating from that wellhead. There is not oil emanating from the riser either.
The markets were watching nervously.
BP's share price did come down on the back of the news, but investors remained relatively calm in the company, waiting to see how the accident would unfold.
Even when the oil started to appear on the surface and defences were thrown up along the coastline, to many, the leak still didn't seem that serious. President Obama was sufficiently relaxed to go away for a long weekend. But then, the oil started coming ashore, and scientists increased their initial estimate of the leak fivefold.
It was the first indication that we potentially had a very major environmental disaster on our hands. Obviously that was bad news for BP. There's a regulation in the US called the Clean Water Act, under which you get fined for every barrel of oil that actually flows into the waters of the Gulf. The more oil flows into the Gulf of Mexico, the higher the potential legal liabilities and the potential claims.
More than 2 weeks after the oil spill off the Louisiana coast, BP is still having issues.
Shares of oil giant BP are down this afternoon on news that the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico
You are seeing the stock continue to lose ground.
Now, investors were really worried, and the American government's attitude was changing too.
Is there a point, though, where the federal government shifts from oversight of BP to saying, we're taking control and we'll send you the bill?
We are certainly not at that point now, and I don't imagine, given the professionalism of our partner BP and maybe partner was, let me back up.
They are not our partner. They are not our partner.
Partners no more. The government was now distancing itself from the oil company, and the president went to see the damage for himself.
BP is responsible for this leak. BP will be paying the bill.
Okay, I tend to see things, I probably shouldn't say this on the August BBC, but I tend to see things in political terms.
I said at the time, if Franklin Roosevelt had been president, he'd have jumped out of his wheelchair and run down here.
Not only was this a crisis for BP in terms of an operational crisis and a financial crisis, but of course it became a political crisis for President Obama and his administration.
You can see these little balls. These are the tar balls that they're talking about.
And it was made very difficult because of where it occurred in the election cycle, and by the fact that it was a Democratic White House and governors along the Gulf Coast were all Republicans.
As the political temperature rose, the tone of the administration and the media changed.
There was an absolute anti-British sentiment being expressed deliberately. Everyone in the administration knows BP by name BP. I haven't heard the term British Petroleum in years in the United States.
BP British Petroleum.
British Petroleum.
British Petroleum. British Petroleum.
British Petroleum.
British Petroleum.
British Petroleum.
British Petroleum.
British Petroleum was to remind the American people, this is not one of our companies, folks.
As the oil washed up along the Gulf Coast, Tony Hayward tried to protect his company against further damage. But his media appearances weren't always helping BP's cause.
This was not our drilling rig, it was not our equipment, it was not our people, our systems or our processes. This was Transocean's rig, their systems, their people, their equipment.
What do you think the environmental impact of this disaster will be?
I think the environmental impact of this disaster is likely to have been very, very modest.
BP was on the back foot, and the networks smelt blood.
The network anchors had descended on BP in Louisiana, and it was an enormous feeding frenzy.
Where ultimately in this disaster does the buck stop?
But I'm focused on the response.
We're going to fight it subsea, on the surface and on the shore.
Sounds like you're referring to Churchill, who I know you like to quote.
I believe we're fighting a battle.
We tried to be open and transparent. We gave access to the operation, but the reality is we were completely overrun and just not prepared to deal with the intensity of the media scrutiny.
That's your oil.
I know. I'm gutted. I'm absolutely devastated.
We're seeing more of the heartbreaking and horrifying images of wildlife suffering. Helpless pelicans, the pride of Louisiana, and other native birds smothered in heavy, gooey oil.
Devastating for the environment and disastrous for BP.
One image was to go around the world. It became the symbol of the disaster and destroyed BP's carefully nurtured green reputation. A month into the crisis, around 500,000 barrels of oil had spewed into the Gulf. While Tony Hayward was fighting on the beaches, President Obama was facing a rearguard action closer to home.
This is what I wake up to in the morning, and this is what I go to bed at night thinking about. And when I woke up this morning, and I'm shaving, and Malia knocks on my bathroom door, and she peeks in her head, and she says, did you plug the hole yet, Daddy?
BP had made several ever more desperate attempts to kill the well, but they had all failed.
BP's contingency plans were inadequate. We were making it up day to day. What was going on was some extraordinary engineering. But when it was played out in the full glare of the media, as it was, of course it looked like fumbling and incompetence.
By the end of May, the company's best hopes of plugging the leak rested on pumping heavy drilling fluid down the well in an operation known as Top Kill. The markets knew that if Top Kill was unsuccessful, the well might not be sealed for months. With the latest estimates of the spill rising further, the company's financial position was growing yet more perilous.
I remember being in the control room in Houston. The whole team had assembled. We were all watching the charts, listening to the readout, and there was an incredible feeling of hope.
But this was uncharted territory. Such an operation had never been attempted at these extreme depths. For 3 days and nights, the scientists and the country watched as the operation continued.
We've said all along that we rated this at 60 to 70%. That has not changed. That was interpreted by the world to be, it's going to work. And I can remember turning and punching the shoulder of the guy who was leading the technical effort, saying, we've really got this.
America waited.
Of course it wasn't to be.
We're all very disappointed that the Top Kill didn't work. What we've learnt through this is, of course, a lot about what it will take to contain the well.
If we'd been successful in killing the well in the first week of June, so many things would have been different, not least I probably would have still been the CEO of BP.
With BP failing miserably to contain the Gulf oil leak, is it time to consider putting the company under temporary government receivership?
Share price falls in London and New York have wiped out $100 billion.
British Petroleum is losing millions and millions of dollars probably every second.
BP's share price just dropped off a cliff. They suffered their worst fall in 18 years as investors just sent the shares down because they were just so worried about what this meant for BP in the longer term.
At that point, that was when I cut my recommendation to a sell and became a lot more bearish about the situation in the Gulf of Mexico.
When the top kill failed, it turned everything. It turned the political environment. It turned the market, and those two things began to feed on each other.
With BP facing a lot of criticism about how they're handling this whole crisis, President Obama is now facing calls to push the company out of the way.
And then, the defining moment, which was to overshadow the chief executive's handling of the whole disaster.
The first thing to say is we're sorry. We're sorry for the massive disruption it's caused to their lives. And, you know, there's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back.
I thought this person is really exhausted, that his mind is not working effectively to say something like that.
If I had done a degree at RADA rather than a degree in geology, I may have done better. I'm not certain it would have changed the outcome, but certainly the perception of myself may have been different.
He's too intelligent a man to say something that foolish as a throwaway line, and I pitied him.
That was a smug, ugly, arrogant thing to say. And even with, you know, that British accent makes it...
BP presents Try Finding Nemo Now.
BP taking credit for boosting the economy in the Gulf is like Al-Qaeda taking credit for creating jobs in airport security.
See, that's, he's wearing a jumpsuit there. That means he's serious about solving the problem. Or he's practicing for jail.
You know, it's very difficult to hate a company. It's much easier to hate an individual.
He doesn't work for you, but if he did, would you want him out?
He wouldn't be working for me after any of those statements.
Of course, I regret some of the remarks that I made.
And it wasn't just the mainstream media piling on the pressure. Deepwater Horizon was the first major oil disaster of the internet age. And viral media were influencing people as much as the US networks.
This fake BP Twitter site has 10 times more followers than the real one.
I am the figure, the face of the company, and I became demonized and vilified.
He was in charge. He was the person who was supposed to be accountable. And if he's vilified, that vilification simply reflects the degree of public upset.
BP accountable! Shut them down!
We'll go down as a case study of a business that has had to respond to a tremendous challenge that went on for some time in that sort of media storm. And I think politicians will study it as well, because it made their jobs very difficult.
Determined to show action, the president set up a special investigation into the crisis, led by two senior Washington insiders.
Good morning, everybody. I just met with these two gentlemen, former Senator Bob Graham of Florida and former EPA Administrator Bill Riley.
President Obama said, I want you to follow this right to wherever it goes. Let the facts speak for themselves. No limitations. You'll have full cooperation from everybody in the government. If you don't, let me know.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
I happened to say to the president as we were going off into the Rose Garden that he was under so much pressure to display anger. And I said, everybody else is. I think it's good if you don't. And that's his temperament anyway. And he said, well, just so long as we don't have any more crises this year, I think I've had enough. And he certainly has.
But 2 days later, those words of advice had been forgotten. President Obama's anger flared when he heard about BP's latest public relations campaign, which reportedly cost $50 million.
The Gulf spill is a tragedy that never should have happened. I'm Tony Hayward. BP has taken full responsibility for cleaning up the spill in the Gulf.
What I don't want to hear is when they're spending that kind of money on their shareholders and spending that kind of money on TV advertising, that they're nickel and diming fishermen or small businesses here in the Gulf who are having a hard time.
The president was also annoyed about BP's dividend payout, still due in 2 weeks' time.
There are reports that BP will be paying $10.5 billion, that's billion with a B, in dividend payments this quarter. Now, I don't have a problem with BP fulfilling its legal obligations, but I want BP to be very clear, they've got moral and legal obligations here in the Gulf.
But if the president really wanted to hold the company to account, BP's executives now felt his words weren't helping.
I don't sit around just talking to experts because this is a college seminar. We talk to these folks because they potentially have the best answers, so I know who's asked to kick.
We had some very frank discussions with the White House explaining that their words were creating difficulties for BP.
So if you're a British petroleum executive, get up really close to your TV. This is a President Barack Obama ass-kicking simulation.
Place ass to screen now.
Companies need to be accountable, and part of the process of accountability in a democratic society is to be publicly criticized for what they have done and failed to do.
The politicians, in part, did not understand the linkage between the political rhetoric and the crisis of confidence which was occurring both in the equity markets and in the debt markets.
Now, in the middle of June, as BP grappled with further attempts to cap the well, it looked like the company was in danger of unraveling.
It was a classic financial crisis issue. It wasn't about the cash flow of the company, it was about the liquidity.
Large companies rely on short-term loans. In BP's case, anything up to $10 billion. The problem for them was that it was getting all but impossible to borrow enough money because lenders feared it may not be able to pay them back.
The confidence of the markets had been rattled by, firstly, the spectre of this thing going on for a long time, and secondly, the amount of political concern that was being raised in the United States.
BP was now fighting a battle on 3 fronts: environmental, political, and financial. Many traders were acting as if they believed there was a real possibility of the company collapsing. To avoid a full-blown meltdown, they needed to reach a truce with the president.
We'd been in a discussion with the White House for several weeks about how we would demonstrate to the politicians and the people of America that BP was absolutely going to stand by the commitments that we'd made.
By setting limits to its compensation payouts, the company hoped to reassure the markets. But as the BP executives assembled in Washington, the president was in no mood for compromise.
I'm going to speak to the nation tonight about this. But let me say to the people of Pensacola and the Gulf Coast, I am with you. My administration is with you for the long haul, to make sure BP pays for the damage that it has done and to make sure that you are getting the help you need.
The impression was very much that they would try and squeeze as much as they could out of BP. All of that would have been feeding into the markets and created even more nervousness.
To add to the pressure, on the same day, one of the main rating agencies slashed BP's credit rating.
What it effectively means is that the rating agency was worried about BP's ability to repay its debt. For BP, it was sort of fighting fires on all fronts.
This crisis didn't end. It started on the 21st of April, and it went on and on and on.
It's day 56 of the BP oil spill. Again, the live picture, 5,000 feet underwater.
We're going to keep you on the BP story. It's down 50% since the explosion in April.
Nothing's going their way right now. That pressure's not letting up.
Prior to the meeting with the White House, the capital markets were effectively closed to BP. We were not able to borrow in the capital markets, either short or medium-term debt at all.
It is very difficult to come back from that. These were frightening days. Say, with a company the size of BP, its reputation, what it does, you almost can't quite believe how close you are.
Even long-standing trading partners were doubting whether BP could settle its bills.
Bank of America called, wouldn't buy crude from us. Suppliers were asking for money up front. This was a very unusual environment for BP.
Could it still keep on paying its bills? Could it keep paying its staff? Could it keep paying its rents?
It was a very, very intense period.
Is BP headed for bankruptcy?
Could they be possibly thinking about bankruptcy still?
This company's losing $350 million a day.
How much trouble is this company in?
It's in a lot of trouble here. I mean,
they have to look at bankruptcy.
As the executives hunkered down at the Jefferson Hotel, BP was on the brink. The next morning, time to meet the president.
We had been up most of the night before preparing for the meeting. The security around the White House was extraordinary that day. We walked up to the White House.
The mood in the BP team was clearly somber, but very purposeful.
And there were probably 250 reporters outside with cameras watching. That's when we realized the magnitude of the significance of the event. We were in the meeting room with at least half the cabinet, and we spent time together talking for about 45 minutes informally, and then the president came in with the vice president.
The team from BP knew they would have to meet the president's demands for a $20 billion compensation fund. But the timing of the payments was the issue, and hammering out a deal was not going to be easy.
We didn't really know what the Obama administration was really going to say. They could have quite easily turned around and kicked BP out of the States if they felt like it.
It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't aggressive, it was practical and workmanlike, because we had a task to accomplish, which was to reach a very important agreement.
And BP was also worried about the rhetoric coming out of Washington.
In periods of uncertainty, there are reactions, or statements are made. I don't think people realize the impact it was having on the business.
As the two sides wrangled, the meeting overran. After 4.5 hours, the president finally emerged. BP was to spread its compensation payments over 4 years.
I'm pleased to announce that BP has agreed to set aside $20 billion, and I'm absolutely confident BP will be able to meet its obligations to the Gulf Coast and to the American people.
There was almost an unspoken agreement that some of the political rhetoric would diminish.
BP is a strong and viable company, and it is in all of our interests that it remains so.
The markets rallied.
The language changed at that point, I think. We actually had a number now in terms of what all this was going to cost, and BP had to find $20 billion from somewhere. Really, we were talking about BP's survival at this point.
The three certainties of life were about to be cut to two.
The BP board has today decided that we will not pay any further dividends this year.
BP had bought itself time, but the shareholders had paid the price.
For BP to cut the dividend was a huge problem, not only for the city because of the shock that it caused at the time, but it also caused a big problem for the pension industry because the pension companies had to come up with a plan B in terms of how they could fill that gap.
The company had staved off financial crisis, but it still faced huge uncertainty.
It was certainly an important moment because it created alignment between us and the administration, and it created the basis on which the American people could feel that BP was absolutely going to meet its obligations in a full and complete way. But of course, at that point, the well was still pouring oil and gas into the Gulf of Mexico.
The day after his meeting in the White House, Tony Hayward was summoned to a special hearing on Capitol Hill. Members of Congress had spent weeks investigating the explosion on BP's oil rig, and they were ready for a showdown.
We were prepared. We were ready to go. The American people were looking for answers. Here was the chance for BP to shed some light on what happened.
But BP faced a dilemma. Besieged by lawsuits and a criminal investigation, any admissions of liability could make their situation even worse.
He sat in a room, and these lawyers said, you don't say this, because everything you do, these plaintiff lawyers are going to have every word you say. You're going to be cross-examined. This is going to be part of the record. And he is told to sit there and shut up and say nothing and just take it.
Politicians believed the hearing would be Tony Hayward's last stand.
Your safety record, you have 26 people dead, more than 170 injured. You have the largest spill ever in Alaska. You now have the largest environmental disaster that hit the United States. Should there be a ban on companies that have miserable safety and environmental records?
In the 3 years that I've been CEO, I've focused on improving dramatically our safety and environmental performance.
Instead of being contrite, instead of being forthcoming with information, he was defensive, and he added to the distrust that Americans already felt.
We're talking about our way of life.
He called your decision, and I'm quoting, horribly negligent.
I, like everyone else here and everyone else in America, is thoroughly disgusted.
You go from being a powerful guy, you're the CEO of BP, you're a big shot, to sitting there with 2 hours sleep, having congressmen that you're accustomed to having your way with just sit there and clobber you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You just sit there and take it.
Are you failing to cooperate with other investigators as well? Because they're going to have a hard time reaching conclusions if you stonewall them, which is what we seem to be getting today.
I'm not stonewalling. I simply was not involved in the decision-making process. When I was asked to answer questions about what happened, I didn't know what happened because we hadn't completed the investigation. So the appearance of evasiveness was about the fact that there were no facts at that point.
BP had an opportunity to explain to the American people, and quite frankly, they blew it. He was going to do whatever he could to protect the company, so he wasn't going to answer our questions.
By the end of the 5.5-hour grilling, another 500,000 gallons of BP's oil had leaked into the Gulf. But the company had survived the worst week in its history. The final scene in the demise of Tony Hayward was played out not on the beaches of Louisiana, but off the genteel Isle of Wight. 2 days after the hearing in Washington, he came here to meet his son, who was taking part in a yacht race. But there would be no shelter from the voracious media.
A man who looked a lot like BP chief Tony Hayward sailing Hayward's boat in a yacht race off the coast of England today.
Another PR gaffe for BP? Well, you be the judge.
And of course, that anger heightened with those pictures of the yacht race coming out, the sense that Hayward was out not...
That was the height of stupidity, and I believe myself that he should go.
Quote Tony Hayward, he's got his life back, as he would say. I think we can all conclude that Tony Hayward is not going to have a second career in PR consulting.
I have to confess, at the time I was pretty angry, actually. I hadn't seen my son for 3 months. I was on the boat for 6 hours between the hours of midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning US time. And, you know, I'm not certain I'd do anything different. I wanted to see my son.
Then in July, BP's directors gathered in London to assess the impact of the cost of the cleanup and compensation claims on their balance sheet. With the latest results imminent, media speculation was rife.
BP is expected to report a loss of almost $15 billion tomorrow.
The numbers were not pretty.
The company reported a loss of some $17 billion for the
Tony Hayward will resign as head of the oil giant come October.
It was the biggest ever single quarter loss in British corporate history. Tony Hayward stepped down.
When I told my son I was planning to resign, he said, well, you're going to do that in a couple of years anyhow, so what's the big deal? The kids move on really fast, you know.
His place was taken by Bob Dudley, who just happens to be an American.
I don't feel like I've been made a scapegoat. I think I recognise the realities of the world we live in. In some senses it comes with the patch, and you simply have to take the rough with the smooth, actually.
The week after Hayward's resignation was announced, the Macondo well was finally sealed.
The long battle to stop the leak and contain the oil is finally close to coming to an end. And we are very pleased with that.
The blowout preventer was recovered from the seabed. This fail-safe device on the well is now being examined to find out why it didn't work. The official investigation into the accident will report in January. BP accepts some failings and criticizes its two main contractors on the rig, Transocean and Halliburton, whilst they both criticize BP. As with most industrial accidents, this one appears to have been caused by a series of failures, and all three companies are likely to end up sharing the blame. Earlier this month, BP returned to profit after last quarter's record loss.
So coming out of this disaster, the company has had to respond quickly, shore up its balance sheet, make sure that it's got reduced debt, has been selling $25 to $30 billion of assets to be able to ensure that it can meet its obligations. That, by definition, will make the company slimmer. We're going to learn a lot from it. It's going to make us look again at our own risk management around the world.
But in America, where over 40% of BP's assets are, the political fallout from the spill has proved almost as toxic as the oil which leaked into the Gulf.
It'll be harder to work with the government for BP given this history in Alaska, in the Gulf, anywhere in the United States. The company will have to accept that, not complain about it, but accommodate to it and show that strike three is it. There's not going to be a fourth strike.
They're at the bottom of the barrel right now, through their own actions. It's going to be a long, hard climb to move back up to where they once thought they were.
On the shores of the Caspian Sea lie some of the world's first commercial oil fields. This was the new frontier once. These relics stand testament to our insatiable appetite for oil. A century on, our addiction drives an ever more desperate quest for new reserves. Big oil will continue to push back the frontier, drilling deeper, further, taking on ever more risk. BP's $30 billion blowout shows the price we're all paying for this dependency.
I was and I remain devastated by the accident. Not all of the stuff that went on afterwards, because at the end of the day we've cleaned up the oil, we can restore the environment, we can put people's lives back to how they were in the Gulf Coast, but what we can never do is bring back the 11 people who lost their lives, and I feel real accountability for that.
September the 11th, 2001 dominates almost everything we watch, read and hear. We're fighting a war on terror, say George Bush and Tony Blair, a noble war against evil itself. But what are the real aims of this war? And who are the most threatening terrorists? Indeed, who is responsible for far greater acts of violence than those committed by the fanatics of Al-Qaeda? Crimes that have claimed